El Mesías was one of the very first programs that Border Crossing started. I wanted to perform a concert at a Lady of Guadalupe church in September of 2017. Initially, it was just going to be a simple thing with piano and a few singers. And then somehow we managed to raise some money and were able to hire an orchestra and get more singers involved, and the Minnesota Chorale jumped in. Then as we were putting it together, we realized that in that space, it was okay to perform Messiah, but wouldn't it be fun if some of this were in Spanish? So we started translating it to Spanish. Navidad Nuestra is a cantata that in South America gets performed for Christmas all the time. Wouldn't it be cool if we performed this? So then we performed Messiah and Navidad Nuestra. So what is Mesías? Mesías is a mashup of Navidad Nuestra and Handel's Messiah Part 1. This piece can't all be in Spanish. There is more power in the two languages interacting with each other and going back and forth than just hearing it once. The other thing that I realized is that I can't just make up text. That made it tricky because that meant finding words that had the same number of syllables, finding words that had the accent on the right syllable so that it matched with the music. And also there are things where Handel does text painting, where a really famous passage is in the aria Every Valley. You have the crooked. So on the word crooked, you have all these notes going up, straight, and just a single note on the word straight. Or when the soloist sings the word plain, plain, it's just these long notes. So that also needed to match. In the Spanish translation, when we say torcido se enderece, we need to make sure that when the soloist is actually saying the word torcido, the melody is twisting around. But then, as we were going, Messiah and, a lot of music that we perform from hundreds of years ago has elements that are problematic now or insensitive now that weren't considered so back then. With Messiah, there's been books written about the anti-Semitic language in Part 2, and so the anti-Semitic and ableist language in Part 1. And as I was translating, I realized that some of those Spanish translations that I was looking at didn't have the same issues. An example I really like is the recitative before he shall feed his flock, and the eyes of the blind shall be opened, because I have a friend in choir who's blind, and she always sort of cringed at the words, and the eyes of the blind shall be open. But the Spanish translation isn't the blind, it's los que no ven, the ones that will not see. In my opinion, it's a little bit more deeper, in some ways, more profound. This is the first time that we are performing the entirety of Part 1 of Messiah in this translation. And in this second half, we have the new translation of He Shall Feed His Flock, with the recitative right before it, then the eyes of the blind shall be opened. And we're also performing in the second half the full pifa. So every time we perform this, we're adding a bit that's new and trying to just make it better every time. A few years ago, the Minnesota Orchestra, they took this fabulous initiative to perform one of my favorite pieces in the world, which is La Pasión según San Marcos by Argentine composer Osvaldo Golijov. And they were going to collaborate with La Scola Cantorum de Venezuela, but the Venezuelan singers couldn't all come. And the only really local choir that was equipped to do a piece like that was Border Crossing. So that was our first collaboration with the Minnesota Orchestra. Border Crossing performed for La Pasión with Venezuelan conductor Maria Guinand.
Border Crossing, from the very first moment I met them, was a choir not only beautifully prepared, but so intelligent to learn what was behind the notes, what was the cultural process and the cultural message of La Pasión. I think that also the work that was done by the orchestra, being so concentrated, so close together to the singers, the scenic proposal that Marcela was creating, all that was a mixture of elements that produced a unique experience for the audience, and we felt from the audience, we felt that gratitude and that reaction and response.
I worked with members of Border Crossing very closely in a capacity, not only as stage director, but as movement coach for them. I just applaud every time that an institution takes such huge risks, because the payoffs are enormous, and what we learn from that and what the orchestra contributed to the community is huge.
So we all felt that we should do something again at some point, as we tend to say. So I reached out and said, hey, we would love to do Mesías with the orchestra. This is the first time that only Border Crossing will be on stage with the Minnesota Orchestra as equal musical partners. The part that I'm most excited about is that the third performance, we get to take the Minnesota Orchestra with us to Church of the Ascension.
For so many Spanish speakers to hear this particular piece of music, hearing the familiar tunes, but in another tongue, hearing the lyric differently, that only affirms what we're trying to do in this community and bringing people of very different life experience and cultures. I mean, this collaboration with Minnesota Orchestra is so wonderful because, of course, the culture of encounter, which is at the heart of Border Crossing, might touch a lot of folks.
When I have to explain what Mesías is all about in a short sentence, it's just really hard, because that's not how it was created. It sort of came together and we kept adding pieces to it. I remember a review we got about it a couple of years ago where the reviewer said, on paper, this feels like it shouldn't work, but it does. It somehow works.